claim the Bible makes has been disproved. For example, through many different independent fields of study, we know that there was never a global flood. We don't just know that it couldn't possibly happen, but even if it could miraculously happen, even if it could magically happen, we still know that it didn't happen. That even if there was a God, which there isn't, but even if he could do all that, which he can't, but even if he could, we still know that he didn't, because it isn't indicated by anything anywhere, and everything everywhere indicates something else instead. We know that there were many different floods, flood legends that don't match anything in the Bible. You know, where the only survivor is a man and woman hiding out in a seashell, for example, or other such stories like that. But then there's, in the Mesopotamian, or excuse me, in the Iraqi floodplain, which actually is a floodplain, there's a handful of stories about Pishtim, Ubartutu, Atrahasis, Ziusudra, and eventually Noah, after enough exaggeration, that we know these stories are all talking about the same event. And there is an inundation of the city of Shuruppak that has been confirmed by geologists and archaeologists to have occurred around 2900 BCE. And this, evidently, is the story that all of these others are based on, including the one in the Bible, which is a much later adaptation. The important detail here, apart from releasing the bird and doing the sacrifice in the mountain, all of these sorts of details, the important detail was verified by the geologists was the depth of the flood, estimated to be 22 feet, which is 15 cubits. And that might be 7 meters, but it's hard to find a cubits to meters conversion ratio online. Now, this would have been sufficient to wipe out everything in the city of Shuruppak, everything you could see except for maybe treetops. And by the way, if you read the original version in Ziusudra, it's a much more grisly detail. You know, somehow it's all Disney-like chirping birds and cartoon images when you read the biblical version, but the Ziusudra version is a lot more grotesque. Now, 15 cubits would not be enough to cover Mount Ararat, which is 3 miles high, and it would not have any effect at all on Egypt, which is thousands of miles away, which brings me to a different story. One of my favorite YouTubers, Potholer54, if you haven't seen him, you should look him up, he's really good. He did a video recently where Answers in Genesis had released or published a statement explaining how they could go from 8 people surviving the global flood that they imagined to have happened around 2188 BCE to 7 billion people today by doubling the population every 150 years, taking into account wars, famines, pestilence, and disregarding or ignoring everything we know about population growth over time, because that's scientific data and who cares about that. However, if Answers in Genesis is correct, and when has this ever been true? That would mean that if the entire global population had collaborated to build the first Egypt's pyramids, they couldn't do it because there would have only been 40 people alive at that time in the whole world. Now, Answers in Genesis understands that there would have to be a society of at least 30,000 people to provide the infrastructure necessary for a project of that magnitude. So they came up with a different article that explains that their population growth was actually 10 times faster than they previously mentioned, but they didn't mention that they previously mentioned it. They did a completely different calculation. So what they said was that one man and his one wife came to Egypt with 8 children. Now, one man being married to one woman is rare in the Bible, but this was immediately after a global genocide or extinction event. And AIG assumes that they had 8 children. The Bible actually says he only had 4 sons. But daughters were never important enough to be named or even mentioned on most occasions. So these apologists assume, without any reason at all, because that's what apologists do, that they also had 4 daughters. And then they assume that each of these brothers married his sister and had 8 kids with her over generations of 30 years per generation, with subsequent sons sleeping with their sisters, despite all the inbreeding. And they would have, in 150 years, they would go from 8 people to 30,000 people, who by then would be so genetically disadvantaged that they would believe the sorts of things that Ken Ham says. Now let's ignore that they got all their dates wrong. The step pyramid of Zoser is typically estimated to have begun construction around 2630 BCE. And that means it already existed before the flood, but they put that 2188, but they got the wrong date for the flood too. Now that was 2900 BCE, and that actually gives them more time than they thought they had. But their calculations also depend on the Tower of Babel, which was 500 years later than they thought, and even on the date that they gave, that the step pyramid of Zoser is still prior to that, so their myths are out of order, but that's not the point. The point is that they have two different calculations with fictional figures telling two different lies at the same time, and they don't want anybody to notice that they're telling two different lies at the same time. And I've noticed Answers in Genesis doing this quite often. Another example is where I found two of their paleontologists, because they pay scientists to lie to the public for them. In one case, they said that Acanthus stega, for example, was not a transitional species because its legs were clearly designed for swimming, and the other one said that it couldn't be a transitional species because the legs were clearly designed for walking. So they can't agree on which side of that imaginary line it is, but it's 100% on both, which I think is the criteria required for a transitional species. Now, another problem with AIT's calculation of population, and this is another one you probably won't hear from anybody else but me, because I'm the one who sat down and did the math for it. They have this one story where you have a couple of million Hebrew slaves in one town in Egypt at a time when the entire population of the country was only 3.5 million. So if you include the Hebrews, they outnumbered the entire natural national population. Why didn't they not own that place already? Because remember, when they cut loose, they cut down everyone around. According to the Bible, these desert brigands killed millions of people. They were unstoppable. They killed hundreds of thousands at a time, more than Answers in Genesis can even admit were alive at that point. So there's another, separate article they have to come up with for how God's chosen people chose to kill everybody else. So if we excuse all of the Hebrew women and children and just consider the 600,000 men on foot that were supposed to be in the town of Ramses, and let's say that they head for the promised land. They go into Canaan, and they follow the coastline up the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And they march single file, each man, 1 meter ahead of the next, which is a reasonable distance. If they walk 20 miles a day, it would take them a fortnight to get there. And the first ones would get there before the last ones left. 600 men, 1 meter away from each other, right? It's only 450 meters or 280 miles. And it's hard to get lost when you're following the coastline. But the Bible says that with God's help, a 2-week trek turned into 40 years of wandering lost in the desert. Now, how's that for divine guidance? And this 40 years of the blind leading the blind happened at a time when most people didn't live that long. And so nobody that started out the trip was alive by the end. The children that were born along the way were the only ones that ever could have gotten out again. So none of the numbers add up, and creationists know that, but they don't care, because this isn't an attempt to understand anything. This is all about make-believe. It's entirely pretend. Deceivers seek believers because they need patsies to pay their tithe and to reinforce their preferred delusions. And this is true of all religion, but creationism is a form of religious extremism that actively denies reality. It's not just that, the difference, I should say, between creationists and regular Christians who accept science is that creationists not only reject evolution specifically, that's the requirement to be called creationists, but more generally, their real target is methodological naturalism. They want to believe in magic. They want to use magic as an explanation. What they call miracles. They don't call it magic. They won't accept that it is magic, but that's what it is. So their faith is so willfully obtuse that it actually matches the description that psychiatrists give of psychotic delusion. In fact, if you look up on the National Alliance of Mental Illness, you'll see what they give a definition for delusion, and they give a definition for psychosis. And it's, both cases, they're describing religion. I mean, they say, for example, a delusion is a persistent false belief that will not change despite evidence to the contrary, to falsely claim something when there is evidence otherwise. That's a delusion. So creationism is a delusion, whether it's pathology, whether it's a mental illness, I'm not saying that, but it is a delusion nonetheless, by definition. Psychosis, similarly, is a loss of contact with reality. But interestingly, the NAMI puts on a provision, except when it's religion. Somehow it's only okay when religion does it. So in my book, I cover a lot of the science that's specific to this, as I said, without having to go through any generalities you would normally. If you go for an education, in any of the sciences, you'll have to get all this periphery that won't necessarily pertain to this particular argument. So I'm just giving you the specific information that you need for this. And I don't think anybody else has ever written a book like this. It also covers the hypocrisy and the dishonesty and the absurdities, atrocities, inconsistencies, and contradictions in the Bible, as well as prophecies that are often claimed but have actually failed rather spectacularly when you read what the prophecy actually says and what really happened. So the purpose of my book is to provide a biological and theological reference to explain how to refute the fundamentalists' favorite fallacies in their attack on the sanity of science and secularism. Thank you very much.